Hello, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 2 today. This is a very important chapter for the entire interpretation of the book. For the image that Nebuchadnezzar is going to see in his dream is the image that is developed throughout the book. We see it reoccur in chapter 7 particularly, where it deals with the fourth kingdom. And in chapter 8, it comes back to the second and third. And then the rest of the book, it kind of is focusing in on a primary detailed interpretation of the fourth kingdom. And there's been much discussion about what those kingdoms are, but I think we'll come to that later in the book when we deal with each one of them specifically. But just to know, this is a very, very important chapter in setting the stage for the prophecy of kingdoms to come upon the earth. Notice in verse 1 where it says, "Now in the second year in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar." Now the second year, if you'll read chapter 1 verse 1, it seems to be that it's out of chronological order. Now the chapter begins with an "and" in Hebrew, which means it's connected. There have been several theories about the possibility of this date being how it relates to chapter 1:1. The first one is that there simply is a chronological discrepancy here, that chapter 2 should go before chapter 1. But I think that we're dealing with two problems. Number one, we have two different calendars. We have the Syrian calendar and the Babylonian calendar. And one of them would count the partial year as the first year of a king's reign, and the Babylonian calendar did not record the first partial year as the first year. And that may be the discrepancy here. But also, I think we need to realize that we're just not certain. It may be in the period of where he's still going to school is what it wanted to say, okay? Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and of course the name means, may Nebo guard the boundary, all right? Nebuchadnezzar II had dreams. Now the Hebrew here is plural. Maybe he had this dream over and over again, and that's what bothered him, okay? And his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. We have now many cuneiform documents from the Babylonian period. And there's one, it's called Old Babylonian Omen Text, that says, "If a man cannot remember the dream he saw, his God is mad at him." Now maybe Nebuchadnezzar, being superstitious, felt like the fact that maybe he couldn't remember it, or he didn't know the interpretation of it, and that there was something wrong with the gods. And that seems to be because he's going to react so violently here. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. Now, this group of 4 different names are mentioned 5 different times. And so it's all the wise men. Now, when I say magicians and stuff, I think a good term for us would be the scholars, the astrologers, those who are trying to know the will of the gods and manipulate the gods is the group. Now they're called here in chapter 2, 2:27, 4:7, 5:7, 5:11 is where this group appears. Okay? Now, of course, he's calling his men together. These kings did not do anything without knowing the will of the gods. From Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 9 through 11, we know that all of this group is an abomination to God. You say, well, how could Daniel be a part of this? Well, Daniel seems to be known as one of the Chaldeans. And there's been some discrepancy in interpretation because Chaldeans seems to be a racial group in some parts of the Bible, like Genesis 11:28. But in Daniel, it seems to be a group of wise men or scholars or astrologer types. And there's been a lot of discussion about that, which is right. Well, it seems that the word Chaldean may be, as a racial group and as a group of scholars, it may be a misunderstanding of very similar roots. Now, the Sumerian root for Chaldean being wise men may be from master builder, and the root for Chaldean being a racial group may be a very similar root. We're not sure. But Herodotus, in his book, The Persian Wars, mentions that there was both a Chaldean race and a Chaldean group of wise men. And that's very early, Herodotus' Persian Wars. Now, let's see, these magicians. Now, when I think of magicians, it's from the Hebrew term engraving tool, but primarily we're talking about wise men, okay? And then the word conjurers, this is the same group in the New Testament we know as the Magi. Now, the king gave orders for all these groups to be assembled to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Now some, because of the first of verse 5, think that the king forgot what the dream was. But I think a better translation of the Hebrew is, he knows what it is, but he's going to test these Chaldeans by making them tell him what the dream is, and then its interpretation, to ensure that their interpretation is accurate. Now, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. Now, many have thought this Aramaic is a later addition to warn us that the text is going to change. This first little part of Daniel's in Hebrew, but from the beginning of chapter 2, right here in verse 4, all the way through chapter 7, verse 28, it's going to be in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is the lingua franca, or the political language of the ancient empires of the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Chaldeans spoke Akkadian, but Aramaic is a Semitic language, much like Hebrew, and it became what all the peoples in this vast empire understood. And so it became kind of the dominant language, if you please. O King, live forever. This is a very common title for the Eastern potentates. You might want to see 1 Kings 1:31 and Nehemiah 2:3, where it's used again. O King, live forever. It's not saying he's going to live forever. It just is a polite term. May your reign be long, like our long live the king kind of thing. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare its interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. Now, I'm using a New American Standard Version. Look in your margin where it says, another reading is, the word has gone from me. That's King James. And so they're basically thinking that that text, which is a valid text, thinks he's forgotten the dream. But the rest of it, apparently these Chaldeans were very cocky, and they were bragging how much they knew and how close they were to God. And so the king just says, oh yeah? Well, you prove how much you know God and how wise you are. You tell me what the dream is. Well, boy, these guys panicked. I want to tell you, they really panicked. And, of course, God set the stage to bring Daniel on the scene. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your house will be made a rubbish heap. Now, this torn limb from limb, it was a very common way of punishment, capital punishment, of course. Now, some think they bent trees over and tied people to these trees, and then cut the ropes that held them down and would rip the person apart. Others think they were tied to animals, and the animals were hit, and that pulled them apart. We're not sure, but it's sure a gruesome way to die. Now, this deal about a rubbish heap. Some translations have dung hill. Now, we know that when somebody was against the crown, their house was destroyed and all their goods. And so rubbish heap is the appropriate title. But we also know that it was characteristic of this ancient world to use the rubble as a public outhouse, as an ultimate sign of rejection and cursing. And so dunghill would be very appropriate also. Now, let's see. You might want to see for that the word dunghill is used in the Targums. And an example of this is 2 Kings 10:27. So you might want to check that out. But if you declare the agreement's interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward of great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretations. And these wise men answered a second time, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we'll declare the interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. He's saying, you're just trying to weasel out of this. But I'm telling you guys, if you don't tell me, I'm going to kill all of you in the whole empire. Wow. Well, look at verse 10. These Chaldeans start making a series of alibis of why this is unfair. And their first one is, there is no man on earth who could declare this matter for the king. It's really setting the theological stage for God working through Daniel. Look at number 2. First, no man could do this. Number 2, no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of a magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. There's no precedent of this kind of request. Look at number 3. There is no one else who could declare it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. So here are a series of 3 questions really setting the stage for Daniel and his theological affirmation about Yahweh. Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Now, we learn from the several passages in Daniel that Nebuchadnezzar really did throw temper tantrums, and this is very characteristic of the kind of person he was. Now this, and men of all of Babylon, some have wondered if it was a blanket decree that went out through all his kingdom, or if it just means in the capital city of Babylon, because that's where most of these wise men would be. We're not sure. So the decree went forth. They probably were going to gather all of them together for a public execution at one time. And that's why apparently Daniel has some time to seek God in prayer. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch. Now Arioch is a name that means the servant of Aku, which is the moon god. Now this is used, it's a name used in the Bible earlier in Genesis 14:1. Okay? Now he's called the captain of the king's bodyguard. Now the word bodyguard means the chief slaughterer. Now some think it means executioner, and others think it means the one who procured the meat for the king's table. Potiphar in Genesis 7:36 and Genesis 39:1. I may have copied that down. I know it's 39:1. It may be 36:7. You can look up that in your reference Bible. Potiphar is called the chief of the executioners also. He tells Arioch to go to the king. Now Arioch goes and he's going to tell the king he found somebody a little later on down verse 25 looking for the credit. But here is Daniel goes to him. Okay? Look at verse 17. Daniel went before the king and asked for a little time, and the king gave it to him. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friend. Notice the Hebrew names, not the Babylonian names. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven. This is a prayer meeting. The four of them are getting together. Now this title, the God of heaven, is a very common common title for God. It seems to be in reaction to these Babylonian assertions that the stars are gods and that Yahweh is the king of heaven or the God of heaven, the chief God. We see this first used in Genesis 24:7 and again in Ezra chapter 1 verse 2, chapter 6 verse 10, chapter 7 verses 12 and 21, and then in Nehemiah chapter 1:5 and chapter 2:4. It's a very common title for God in the Persian period. Now we're in the Babylonian period, which shows it's earlier than that. And the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Now Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, but Daniel had a vision. God speaks through dreams several times in the Bible. Matter of fact, this whole account is very similar to what Joseph did back in Genesis 41. But a dream is more at an unconscious level, and a vision is more a detailed revelation at apparently a conscious level. Now you can be asleep or you can be awake when you get a vision, but a dream, of course, is only at night when you're asleep. And this is kind of Daniel's psalm or Daniel's prayer of thanksgiving. Daniel answered and said, "Let the name of God," now of course in Hebrew that stands for the character of God, and since the character he's using is Yahweh, it means the ever-living, only living God, "be blessed forever and ever." Catch that idea of longevity of time, the play on the word Yahweh from the Hebrew verb to be, Exodus 3:14. "For wisdom and power belongs to him. It is he who changes the times and epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings." Now I want to tell you how important that is. Here is the Jewish nation in total ruins. The temple has been destroyed. The holy city of God's been leveled. These godly men are taken into exile like Daniel and Ezekiel. Well, the Jews needed to know that God was still in control of history, that he was using Nebuchadnezzar as an instrument of his judgment against his people who had rebelled against him. And it wasn't that Marduk was stronger than Yahweh. Yahweh was in control of history. And this series of interpreted dreams where the wise men of Babylon, their gods, couldn't answer the question, but God and this Hebrew slave could, is a practical example of that theology of the superiority of Yahweh over the gods of Babylon. Now, notice it says he gives wisdom to wise men. Now we'll see James 1:5 there. And knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things and knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To thee, O God of my fathers. Now he's going back to the idea this is the ancient God of Israel, okay? That I give thanks and praise. This is important because the temple and the holy city were in destruction and the Jews were in exile. It's kind of a thanksgiving that God's revealed it to him. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch and told him, "I have the dream. Take me to the king." Now in verse 25 we see that Arioch says, "I found him." Well, that's kind of surprising since Arioch took him to the king back in verse 14. Whatever it is, here's a good example of politicians trying to get credit for all that's happening, all right? And the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar. Now, Belteshazzar is very close to Belshazzar in Daniel chapter 5, but they mean different. Belteshazzar means the name of the god is left out, but it means may protect the life. While Belshazzar is a different translation. Okay, they're very close, but they are different. Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen in its interpretation? The king wants the dream and the interpretation. So Daniel begins to set out. He tells the king what he was thinking before he went to sleep, okay? And then notice that he emphasized that neither these wise men are astrologers. Now we have a new term here, the word diviners in verse 27. This means those, from the term, those who divide. And it's the idea either of those who divide the sky into the different constellations, or those who divide the liver of sheep, which was a way of finding the will of God's. However, verse 20, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. Daniel doesn't say, I know this. He says, the God of heaven, the God whose temple you destroyed, the God whose people you exiled. That is the true God, and he's going to make known this to you where your own gods could not. Now, the word latter days, it's going to be very important that this is going to be a series of 4 kingdoms that will come upon the earth. And in the fourth period, God is going to set up an eternal kingdom. Now this fits for me because I believe the fourth kingdom is Rome. And I believe the eternal kingdom was set up when Jesus was incarnated as a man at Bethlehem. And so God set up an eternal kingdom when Jesus came. Now it's not consummated, but it's here. And that this ambiguity in the phrase, the kingdom of God, it means that reign of God here and now in the hearts of men's lives that will one day be consummated over all the earth at the second coming. Okay? So he begins to interpret the dream. The king was thinking about the future and what would happen. There have been some revolts in his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar is not really known as a king of war, but a king of building. And he had to put down some revolts. Maybe he's thinking about what's going to happen to me. Okay. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. I'm in verse 31. That statue, which was large and extraordinary splendor. The metals seemed to be glowing in the light of the sun. It was a sparkling, very large image he was seeing. That's what scared him. The head of the statue was fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, and its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and potter's clay. Okay? And you continue looking, and a stone was cut without hands, and it struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, all were crushed, all at the same time became like chaff. Well, this seems to be that the kingdoms are contemporaneous, but we know from other parts of the interpretation that they're sequential. But what it does mean is that they stand for human governments, and that God's government, the Messiah, the eternal kingdom, is going to crush human governments completely, seems to be the idea here. The stone, which is a common title for the Messiah. God is called the rock and the fortress. Messiah is called the stone and the rock, and so it's a common title. Now it says, struck the statue, which became a great mountain. Now there is a Babylonian myth that the earth is a large mountain, and that man dwells on the top of it. So you may see the allusion there to back to the Babylonian understanding. Now, this was the dream, and now I'll tell you this interpretation. You, O king, are the king of kings, whom the God of heaven has given kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. That's obvious. Neo-Babylon. And whatever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand. Now this is why he's a good representative of human government, because all authority has been given to him. Now this is why the whore of Babylon, Revelation 28, is used as a symbol of human governments, I think. Okay? Now this wide dominion can be seen as all of God's creation from Genesis 1:28 and Jeremiah 27:6 and 28:14. So he is a very good example of human government. Okay? Look at verse 29. And after you will arise. Now this may be to alleviate his worry that his kingdom's not going to be taken from him, but when he dies, other kingdoms are going to come upon the earth. Now from chapter 7 is the fourth kingdom. Chapter 8 is the second and third kingdom. And chapter 11 is the second, third, and fourth. And then 12 is the fourth extensively. So we're going to deal with these kingdoms later on. Now, notice in verse 41, it mentions the last one is going to be very strong, but it's going to be a divided kingdom. Now this seems to some say the Roman Empire, east and west. Others say it's the Germanic tribes that came in later versus the Roman racial stock, and others say it's the republic versus the dictatorship. I don't think we know exactly what the division means, but it's going to be a divided kingdom. Then in verse 43, it's going to be in the seed of men. Now, many have said this refers to the intermarriage of these different groups to try to gain political stability, but I'm not sure we can back that up. Now, in verse 44, it's very important. It says, in the days of those kings. Now that tells me that what we're talking about is going to happen in that fourth kingdom. And since I believe it's the Roman Empire, something very, very significant is going to happen in the Roman Empire that is going to bring in the eternal Messianic kingdom. So friends, in a real sense, we are in the Messianic age right now. In a real sense, the kingdom of God has already come. In a real sense, we know something about the future because we experience it in a temporary setting. And yet, it is not consummated, it is not complete, it is not full. Now notice where it says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Look at the very end. But it itself will endure forever. Now this tells me we're not talking about a millennial reign here, but the eternal kingdom of God. A millennial reign may be included in some section of this eternal kingdom, but this is not referring to millennial reign. Matter of fact, the Bible often speaks of the kingdom of God as being eternal. Let me give you a few. Daniel 2:44, Daniel 4:2, and Daniel 4:34, Daniel 6:26, Daniel 7:14, 2 Samuel 7:13 and 16, Psalms 45:6, that's quoted in Hebrews 1:8, Psalms 89:36 and 37, Isaiah 9:7, Luke 1:31 through 33, and 2 Peter 1:11. God's kingdom is eternal. That's why I think it's certain in time. Look at verse 45. Inasmuch as you saw a stone cut out of the mountain without human hands. Now I personally believe that refers to the incarnation of Christ, the virgin birth in Bethlehem. It was not a kingdom set up by men, it was a kingdom set up by God. And notice it will crush the iron. This may be an allusion back to Genesis 3:15 about the Messiah crushing the head of the snake. Okay? The iron and bronze, clay, silver, gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. And so the dream is sure. Now, Ibn Ezra, a Jewish commentator, and Rashi both see these verses as messianic. And that's very important we see that. Now in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to do several things to Daniel. But most of us see this, Daniel, as a representative of God, not Daniel allowing himself to be worshipped. When you read Daniel, he's very nervous about taking credit. He always gives God the credit, so we know Daniel's not taking worship here. But look what Nebuchadnezzar does. He fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, sign of worship and reverence. He gave orders to present him an offering. That was a sign that was to the gods. And then he gave fragrant incense, a sign of prayer to the gods. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is the God of gods. This is very superlative. Now, Criswell and E.J. Young believe that Nebuchadnezzar is converted, not here, but in chapter 4. But I really think Nebuchadnezzar is a polytheist. And he's just including God in his pantheon. Now, he believes that God is a great God, maybe the chief of the gods. But he's not saying he's the only God that I must trust personally. He's not saying that. Notice where it says, and a Lord of kings, right? And a revealer of mysteries. Now, this is a very striking thing when you realize that Nebo, one of the chief gods of Babylon, was known as the God of revelation. And here it seemed like Nebuchadnezzar is saying, Yahweh is the true God of revelation, not Nebo. So maybe he's supplanting some of his gods with Yahweh being superior. Now, isn't it striking that Daniel is a poor slave? And that his God, whom Nebuchadnezzar has supposedly defeated by the help of Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's chief god, we learn from his cuneiform tablets, and yet Marduk can't help him, and here is Nebuchadnezzar praising Yahweh. It's very revealing theologically. Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts and made him the ruler over the whole province of Babylon. Now this is not the whole empire, but the province of Babylon, which was one of the satrapies of a larger group of provinces in the kingdom. And the chief perfect, now this is the word governor, over all the wise men of Babylon, okay? And Daniel made a request to the king that he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there's their Babylonian names, over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. He didn't forget his two friends of the prayer meeting. He wanted them, because he trusted them and knew them, to also be officials in the province of Babylon, and they were. And we're going to see that this really caused some problems later on, some jealousy. Now, it's either jealousy based on race, they're Jews and not Babylonians, or it's jealousy based on theology. They're not worshiping the gods of Babylon and we do. But wherever it is, God's going to show his superiority through these 4 Hebrew children compared to the power and pomp and majesty of these ancient Oriental courts. And the first historical section of Daniel, 1 through 6, is really showing that God's in control of history, that God is the only true God. And these world kingdoms are going to be judged in light of their trying to compare themselves with the God of Israel. Now, that's very significant when you see that Jerusalem was in ruins, and all these people believed in national gods, and a military conquest meant a theological supremacy of the gods of the conqueror. But this is showing that is not true, and that God is still in control, and that God is still the God of history and the controller of nations. And so it's a very significant chapter. We can really see how Daniel rose very quickly as a young man to a place of prominence in the providence of God, how he worked this, and how Daniel was brought to a place of great significance, much like the story of Joseph back in Genesis 41 and following. Well, I've really enjoyed being with you, and I hope you'll read through Daniel chapter 3 for our next lesson and outline 2 in your own words. God bless you. Have a good day.